If you enjoy my work, please consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee page. The links to both websites are in the description of this video. As the regular viewers of this channel know, I am very interested in the coming population decline across much of the developed and significant parts of the developing world, its causes and potential consequences. When reading and answering the reactions under my videos, I often get comments that deny the core claim of many of my videos, that the population decline and the birth rate crisis are even a problem. What would you want? For the population of the world to grow indefinitely? Was not the population growth of the past 250 years an anomaly, and we just now need to reach some kind of new equilibrium? Isn't the world's current population already putting such a strain on our planet that it is, in the long run, utterly devastating for the environment? It is not one of the causes of climate change? Hasn't the reduction of the European population caused by the Black Death resulted in an age of unprecedented development in Europe? Won't AI and robotization take care of the problem? And many other similar arguments. And I realized that I never made a video specifically about why exactly it is such an issue. Sure, I talk about it in several, maybe even most, of my videos. However, since it is one of the core issues that my work revolves around, I think it deserves a separate video where I will explain why I think this is an issue to take highly seriously and debunk, or at least address, many of the counter-arguments. Now, many of these arguments certainly have validity and logic to them, so it is definitely not always easy and clear-cut. However, there are several core issues that I firmly believe the people making these arguments do not take into account or maybe even realize. Now, the issue of declining birth rates is a problem on many levels, some of which are cultural. Many people, myself included, see the demographic decline of their nations as a problem by itself. Since, if the preservation of your national cultural heritage is of high value for you, it is a sufficient reason by itself to be alarmed. However, I also understand that this is by no means universal. Many people do not care much about such issues, but see the world and its problems in global terms and not tied to their national culture. That is rooted mainly in every person's psychological makeup and individual experiences. Fair enough. So, in this video, I will once again, as in my previous video on why immigration is not a solution to the population crisis, try to approach the issue from a more practical and economic point of view. I will try to convince people not on board with this idea why the demographic implosion, which has already started but is only gathering its full force, might threaten the world as they know it and why it should be taken seriously. So, I will first try to outline why it is genuinely an issue threatening the global economic system and thus the current status quo of more or less the whole of humanity. And then I will also try to point out certain holes in the argumentation of people that disagree with this statement. Let's get to it. But before we get to the topic itself, let's talk about the sponsor of this video. You know, I talk a lot about demographics. Maybe, if we manage to turn the tide and get out of the demographic pickle somehow, we can colonize space one day. Maybe each country can get its own planet. Planet Czechia. How cool would be that? Very cool. Well, it probably won't happen. But one can still imagine it. And what better way to do that than with the Galaxy Projector 2 from Galaxy Lamps. It is a very cool gadget that allows you to project the image of the beautiful, planetarium-like night sky on the wall or the ceiling of your room. Maybe you want to create a little bit of a romantic vibe to try to work on the demographics with your lady. Maybe you just want to chill in an inspiring surroundings. Go to galaxylamps.co/Kaiserbauch and use discount code Kaiserbauch to get 15% off your order. For the past couple of decades, we have lived in a world of incredibly fortunate demographic conditions that have not been here before and likely won't be here again for a very long time. To somehow start, the economic life of a person can be broadly divided into 4 stages. First, from birth to approximately 20 years, one is a child or a young adult who only consumes but does not produce much of anything. Having a large cohort at this age is a temporary economic cost, since children contribute to dependency ratios the same as retirees, but then they grow up, join the workforce, and start producing. The second economic stage of one's life is approximately between 20 and 45. That is when the majority of the consumption happens. People start families, get mortgages, buy cars, have children, and pay the costs connected to it. But people also, on average, work hardest and are most productive at work. It is completely different to grind hard for 12 hours per day when you are 27 and 55. At 27, it is just part of the lifestyle for many people. At 55, you might be playing with a heart attack. Learning new, cognitively challenging skills is also much easier when you are 30 than when you are 50. So, the younger workers are much more flexible and can react to the changing demands of the labor market. If you did some profession for 30 years, it is doubtful you will now learn to code at 50. A large population in this age group is great for consumption-led economic growth and for being a destination for investment, since there is a large pool of young, productive workers. Another stage, between 45 and 65, is when the consumption declines, even though it is still significant, and investment and savings increase. People traditionally have their children out of their household, have higher incomes, and focus on preparing for retirement by saving and investing their money. Now, this is, to a certain extent, changing, since the family-related behavior of people changes. People have children later, if at all, and the children live with or are supported by their parents longer. But this change makes the issue of population aging even more severe, since it significantly shortens the period in which people do not financially support their children, who are already supporting themselves, but still work and earn an income. So, people who had their kids at 35 might support them until they are 60 and have very little time to invest and financially prepare for retirement. Countries with a large cohort in this age bracket generate much capital for investment, since people want to multiply their savings. The last stage is retirement, when people do not work anymore, do not, on average, produce or earn, but only modestly consume. Ideally, they can spend out of their savings, but realistically, many depend on state-paid pensions. Having the population bulge in this age bracket is just disastrous economically. In the last couple of decades, huge swathes of the developed world have harvested the yields of the demographic dividend. A demographic dividend occurs after a fall in birth rates. Since the number of children is low due to the low birth rates, and the number of pensioners is also low, since the population is only at the start of its aging, there is a temporary rise in the proportion of the population in the working age. Since the average family size decreases, this is often accompanied by increased female participation in the labor force, which helps to reinforce the effects of the demographic dividend. A country's population pyramid in its demographic dividend period looks somehow like this. But after a while, the dividend starts to vanish. As the population ages, the generations born under low fertility enter the labor force, and the population accumulates in the older age brackets. Different developed economies started to enter this period from the 1970s on, when fertility started to go sub-replacement after the post-World War II baby boom. The impacts of the demographic dividend on the economy are very beneficial, since it reduces both public and private spending on children. Thus, people can work and consume a lot, stimulating the economy. The lower the birth rate, the higher the benefit from the demographic dividend, but also the crash when this honeymoon period ends. However, then the world economy got another huge impulse, since just as the massive post-World War II baby boom generations were moving into a more mature, productive stage, the one that generates a lot of investment capital, China, and in the European context also the European ex-Eastern Bloc countries, started to integrate with the world economy massively. The demographics of both China and the post-communist countries in the 1990s and 2000s were prime examples of the demographic dividend, since the fertility went sub-replacement in the 1990s in all of the places, and they had a massive surplus of young working-age people who consume and work a lot. So, there was a synergy of the massive post-World War II generations in the wealthy countries, generating a lot of capital for investment, with the sudden integration of massive Chinese and, less massive but still relevant, Eastern European populations in their demographic dividend period into the global economy, new markets for exports, and new investment destinations. Much of the economic growth in the emerging or developing economies was fueled by the capital glut generated by the Western and Japanese baby boomers looking for a return on their investments, in combination with the consumption of the demographic dividend populations. But this is all coming to an end. The baby boom generation is retiring all across the developed world. We are moving to a stage unseen before, where the population bulges will be in the retired age bracket. The regions leading the way in this regard are East Asia and Germanic continental Europe, where fertility went sub-replacement in the 1970s. Germany, Hong Kong, Japan, Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, South Korea, Finland and the Netherlands are all in the process of their biggest post-war generations already retiring, with every following generation being broadly speaking smaller than the previous one. If not for massive immigration, Canada and the UK would be in this category too. These countries alone constitute around 13% of the world's GDP. In 5 to 10 years, the same process will take place in China, Italy, Taiwan, Denmark or Greece, making it suddenly a third of the world's GDP. In another 15 to 25 years, Spain, Portugal, Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania and many others will follow. And in about 30 years, a bunch of large countries like Russia, Brazil or Iran. Now, there are obviously demographic differences between said countries. In some, the demographic decline and aging will be very steep and can be, without hesitation, called a population collapse. In others, the decline will be more gradual, with every new generation being a little smaller than the previous one. The countries in the collapse group are Germany, Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, Austria, Russia or Poland. The population itself might grow for some time, fueled by immigration. But as the baby boom generations start to die out, the natural decline will be too steep to balance out. The natural decline has already started in Japan, South Korea, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Germany, Austria, Finland, Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, Russia, Poland, and the rest of the post-communist Eastern Europe. Some of these countries' populations are stable or growing modestly purely through immigration. To put it into some numerical perspective, the number of babies born in China in 2022 is around one-third the number born in 1963, the strongest year. In Italy and Japan, the strongest boomer years recorded 2.5 more births than last year. But the true king is South Korea, where the number of babies born in 2022 is less than one-fourth of the 1960 number. It is less than half in Poland and Spain, and in Germany and Finland, about half. There are a bunch of developed countries in better demographic shape, namely the United States, United Kingdom, France, Australia, Sweden, Norway, and New Zealand. That is partially because of large-scale immigration, but also because the fertility in these countries never went under 1.5 children per woman. But even in these countries, clouds are on the horizon. The fertility rate in all the named countries has been either the lowest ever recorded in the last couple of years or close to it. In the UK, the fertility rate was 1.54 in 2021, and while the fertility rate for 2022 was not calculated yet, the lower number of births guarantees that it will be even lower. In the United States, the fertility rate is around 1.65 since 2020, the lowest in American history, and the numbers for 2023 suggest no improvement. In Norway, the fertility rate was 1.4 in 2022, and again, the numbers for 2023 so far point to this level repeating this year. In Sweden, the fertility rate was 1.52 in 2022. And the number of births in 2023 has been so far 5% lower than in 2022, suggesting that the fertility rate this year might be the lowest in Swedish history, going under 1.5 for the first time. France has been solid so far, with the fertility rate in 2022 being 1.75, but the number of births in 2023 has been so far 7.3% lower than in 2022, which suggests that the fertility rate might be the lowest since the First World War and the number of births lowest since the Second World War. It is truly fascinating and disturbing, but something happened in the past couple of years that just sent birth rates worldwide to an even deeper decline than ever before, and this trend is almost universal. Now, many people assign this to the COVID vaccines, somehow messing with fertility, but this very likely is not the cause, because there is no correlation whatsoever between the vaccination rate of the population and the severity of the decline. There are thoroughly vaccinated countries where the number of births since the vaccine rollout has not declined, for example Portugal. I think the true cause is likely the fact that the generations born in the 1990s are entering the reproductive age. To a substantial degree, these generations have grown up in the smartphone internet age. They are some of the most anxiety and other mental health issues ridden generations ever, dealing with a broken dating market, inceldom, climate anxiety, and all the related issues. That is obviously not good for having children, and the whole COVID situation with lockdowns and being online at home for 2 years definitely did not help. But anyway, the mentioned countries are still in a better position than the rest, even though they might follow suit if the current trends continue. But they have more time and more wiggle room. As one Czech saying says, the one with one eye is the king among the blind. Anyway, why is this development so problematic? I will start with the cost side of the equation. These costs will be both public and private, and connected not just to pensions, but also to healthcare systems and various aspects of social care. During the next 30 years, the old age dependency ratio will massively grow in all the relevant world economies. According to the OECD projections, there will be less than 2 economically active people per retiree in the EU, down from 3 today, and just little over 1 economically active person per retiree in Japan, down from 2, or South Korea, down from over 3. There should be 2 in China if we believe the official demographic data coming from the Chinese Communist Party, down from 5 today. But we should probably not believe the data. The data suggesting that the Chinese population has been heavily undercounted are becoming hard to ignore, maybe by over 100 million people. If that is the case, there will be 1.6 working age people per 1 retiree, down from 5 today. Southern European countries will be in similarly disastrous positions as Japan and South Korea. Post-communist Eastern Europe will not be that far behind. In comparison, the number of workers per 1 retiree in the United States will decline from 3 today to 2.5. Painful, but not a disaster. Same as Italy today. But even France, a country with favorable demographics in the context of the developed world, will have an identical number of workers per retiree as Japan has today. Most of the developed world will have worse numbers in 2050 than Japan has today. Even countries like Brazil, Russia, Colombia, Chile or Turkey will have worse numbers than the EU has today. The costs connected to the care for the elderly will thus severely increase, just as the number of people paying into the system will significantly decline. That might happen either through state taxation, in countries where pension systems will be able to stay intact, or from private funds of the citizens, since most people hopefully won't let their parents live in an abhorrent poverty if the pension system crashes. There will, of course, be a significant number of childless pensioners by then, dependent either on the state or on the funds they could save during their lives. A lot of them will live in poverty. Now, whether through state taxation or private funds, the already low number of young people that drive consumption will be burdened by the taxation and the costs connected to the care for elderly parents. That will lower their spending even more, since they just won't have enough capital to do so. In order to generate growth or even maintain the current level of economic output, countries with declining numbers of people in their 20s, 30s and 40s depend on exports. You can observe how the EU's economies became increasingly dependent on exports since the 1990s, just as the last large generations born in Western European countries started to age out of the primary consumption age, and the Chinese market opened up. An alternative example might be Japan, which does not depend on exports much, but, on the other hand, has failed to generate much economic growth at all in the last 20 years. Instead, it has been ballooning its public debt by printing money to stimulate the waning domestic consumption. something that the rest of the developed world has also been doing on a smaller scale by having negative interest rates. Now, I am not saying that demographics cause all the economic problems in the world. That would be reductive, same as any other determinism. Many factors are in play in the economic development of any country. But it is also true that you can clearly observe the influence of demographics on countries that underwent a crisis and then are not really able to restart again somehow properly. Italy is also a good example, since just as the great financial crisis of 2009 hit, the supply of young people started to diminish seriously, and Italy has not really been able to return to reasonable growth. Again, many other factors are in play, but demographics are always an important part of the tapestry. But anyway, since this will happen at so many places at roughly the same time, the possibility of export-driven growth will very likely be severely limited, since there just won't be enough viable export markets. Developed countries are the largest consumer markets, since people have a reasonable amount of money to spend. Let's look at consumer spending by country and add up the markets that will inevitably face demographically driven consumption decline in the coming decades. We find out that they comprise around 45% of the world's consumption market. That is a lot. While the United States is by far the largest consumer market in the world, it still represents just over a third, and American companies have a large share of it. And if the current demographic trends do not change, even the American consumption market might slow down. For this to change, some region or a group of them would have to undergo an absolutely massive economic rise, comparable to the Chinese one, in the coming decades. But, in my opinion, that is not very likely. Many people put their hopes into India, but there are numerous signs that it will be a letdown. There have been talks about India as an economic miracle in the making since the 1980s, but it just never really happened. While India has solid growth, one must remember that it remains a very poor country, with a GDP per capita lower than Papua New Guinea or Palestine. So it is growing from a very low base. A problematic business environment, bureaucratic red tape, protectionism, lack of investment in education and research, lack of infrastructure, and lack of focus on manufacturing are just some of the barriers hampering this vision. Another option that is often brought up is Southeast Asia. But once again, the region now represents around 3.5% of the world consumer market, while China alone represents 14%. There would have to be absolutely remarkable levels of consistent growth for it to be comparable. People have certain conviction that there is some new China in the making just around the corner, but there likely is not. The story of the Chinese economic rise is absolutely unprecedented and caused by the unique synergy of many economic, demographic, and cultural forces. There is nowhere written in stone that there has to be a follow-up, especially without the massive capital glut created by the rich world boomers. But back to the demographics and its impacts. I often feel that people, even analysts and economists, tend not to consider how the impacts of the aging populations compound. Lower consumption, shrinking tax base, lower exports, and higher costs connected to the elderly mean fewer resources that can be used for education, infrastructure, or research and development. The worsening security situation will result in rising military expenditures, curtailing the existing funds and workforce even more. Few young people means loss of the youthful, risk-taking, courageous, reformative energy. Politically, the reforms needed to at least mitigate some of the impacts, for example, significantly lowering pensions, substantially increasing the retirement age, at least partially privatizing healthcare, and overall massively reduce the public spending, will be close to impossible to push through, since the people directly affected by them will have a clear majority in the electorate. The old average age will make countries increasingly status quo oriented. It will be a mess. Do you think politicians will just be like, well, folks, the reason why you feel that everything is getting worse year after year is because you had too few children in the last half of a century. So there is really not much we can do about it at the moment. It's just going to suck. And people will say, oh, so that is the reason. Fair enough, that makes sense. We will go home and burn some tires to keep warm. Probably not. We can prepare for a parade of populist politicians blaming everything and everyone possible for the state of things without telling the people that the true reason is demographic, and there is not a whole bunch that can be done about it immediately. Many measures making matters even worse will be tried. The present is bleak for reasons that we cannot fix in less than a couple of decades. and the future will be even worse. Well, that is not a great election slogan, is it? I will make the country XYZ great again somehow is much better. Now you might say, look at Japan. It has been in this situation for some time and it is not collapsing in any way. But the world is not Japan. Japan is a very wealthy, technologically sophisticated, culturally cohesive island nation with a collectivistic outlook, emphasizing the group's well-being before individualistic needs. Most countries won't be able to sustain long-term economic stagnation or decline without major societal upheaval. Most countries also cannot afford 260% of their GDP in public debt. Moreover, there is nowhere written in stone that even the Japanese situation won't worsen significantly as the dependency ratio deteriorates even further. I mean, let's look at the example of France. There are riots in France when the government increases the price of gasoline, increases the retirement age, police kill a teenager, France wins a World Cup, or France loses a World Cup. How will it look when the old age dependency ratio is the same as in Japan in 2050? And France will by far not be in the worst situation demographically. The world economy is incredibly interconnected. When Greece, a fairly minor country in the international context, was facing potential bankruptcy, the major Western European economies and the United States had to massively intervene to stop the potential domino effects from tanking the world economy. It is close to impossible to predict the development of such a highly complex system, but I would say that it is fairly likely that a massive economic crisis or even a collapse in China alone, something that is, in my opinion, almost unavoidable due to the reduction of the number of working age people per one retiree from 5 to less than 2, will be enough to trigger enormous economic mayhem around the world. But China will just be the largest out of many. Many countries will panic and behave increasingly erratically, creating more damage than good. While autocratic governments, like the Chinese one, do not have to fear elections, they still rely on certain social contracts, mostly based on the increasing living standards of their citizens. This social contract will inevitably be shattered as the living standards decline, and political instability will follow. Sure, some European countries have the wealth, political discipline, and age structures that would allow them to weather the storm, for example Denmark or Sweden. But still, they are thoroughly interconnected with the rest of the continent by trade, since the intra-EU trade accounts for over half of the overall trade of both countries. Sure, some countries will be better off than others, but all will be almost certainly worse off than today. And we likely won't be able to innovate our way out of the pickle, as many suggest. The countries in the population collapse group together account for around 45% of the world's research and development spending and almost 60% of the world's triadic patents. Triadic patents being those registered by the American, EU and Japanese patent offices. Fewer people in those countries means fewer people that can be scientists. A lower tax base means less tax money for science and research. A significantly higher share of this tax money going to care for the elderly means again less going to science, and so on. Innovation is not just created out of thin air. It is a result of hundreds of thousands of people being paid for working on them, mostly to bring products to the market that can then make money to repay that investment and make a profit. Shrinking consumption means shrinking the market for such products and thus lowering the economic incentive to pay for innovative research in the first place. All this without the massive capital available because of the baby boomers before retirement. And while I am speaking about the developed world, since that is where the crisis is actually happening, this is probably even worse for the developing world. Huge swathes of the developing world, mainly Africa, Latin America and the Middle East, are completely economically dependent on the exports of commodities to the rich world. A huge economic crisis and fewer people in the developed world means lower demand for agricultural products, minerals and energy from the developing world, which means a massive crisis there. Now, while most of the rich countries have a lot of room to fall before getting to state disintegration and the danger of famine, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa are not that far from that level even today. So the picture that emerges is quite disturbing. When these issues are discussed, the debate mostly revolves around labor shortages. But that is, in my opinion, the pleasant end of the possible spectrum. It means there still are markets to export to, for whom to produce and build. There just aren't enough people to do so. But the truly scary part will come when there suddenly will be much fewer people for which to build, produce, and sell to. And they will have much less money to spend. Now, if we take into account that it will happen in the majority of the developed world simultaneously in the span of 2 decades, together with all the already existing economic problems, like the high levels of public debt, and those we just do not know about yet, as the coming refrigerator crisis, we might be facing a crisis unlike anything anyone alive in the wealthy world remembers. It will probably be much less bad if you are American or a Canadian. If you are not, like myself and about 75% of my viewers, I just think it will suck. So, in this chapter, I would like to briefly deal with some of the most common denunciations of the population threat I often see. It is obviously true that many of these questions deserve a lot more attention than I can give them now, but I will try to make as much of it as possible. The first is the general notion that fewer people are not a problem, that there were much fewer people at various points in time in the past and countries could flourish. Why do you care if your country has 10 or 8 million people? Some person wrote that Czechia had 8 million people in the past and everything was fine. Yes, that might be true. But the general issue is not necessarily the absolute numbers themselves, it is the age structure. The fundamental problem is created by combining a declining percentage of young people and an increasing percentage of the elderly at the same time almost everywhere where it economically matters. So, I agree that having 8 million people might be better with a healthier age structure, but we are nowhere near that point. If fertility does not change, we will have 8 million people with the same damaged age structure and a further declining population. This ties in with several other often used arguments, for example, the Black Death argument. It is highly probable that after the Black Death wiped out up to a third of the Western European population, it might have opened the way for the European ascension, because the scarcity of workers drove the wages up, paved the way for the end of the serfdom and thus created the basis of the labor market and maybe even capitalism. But there are 2 issues. First, the Black Death very likely wiped out mostly the older and the children. That means the continent was left with an age structure with the prevalence of people in the productive age and high medieval fertility, unlike us today. And secondly, a third of the continent died. I mean, if someone told you a couple of years before the Black Death came that there would be an epidemic of apocalyptic proportions that might kill you, your family, and half the people you know, but if you can survive, it will then slowly throughout centuries transform into an age of unprecedented prosperity. You would very likely be like, well, I'm glad for the unprecedented prosperity in the next centuries at all, but I would still prefer for my family and me not to die in an apocalyptic epidemic. That is also often used in a more general way, where people point to some abstract future after we deal with all the mayhem, the age structures are healthier, the prices of properties decline due to depopulation, the price of labor goes up, people can afford to have more children, and then everything is better. Yes, this might theoretically be the case, but we still have to deal with the mayhem first. It is not like you can close yourself in a cryo chamber and say, wake me up when the age structures are balanced and there is a new age of unprecedented prosperity. Thank you. Or maybe you can. I do not know if some billionaire is watching my videos. Likely not. If yes, send some goddamn money to my Buy Me a Coffee page before you freeze yourself, please. Many people also say that we just have to wait until the somehow unnaturally large boomer generation dies off, which will sort the situation out. That is true for some countries, but not for most. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the problem. If a country had stable fertility, let's say 2 children per woman, then the fertility would shoot up for a generation and stabilize again on the 2 children per woman level. But if fertility remains sub-replacement, every new generation is smaller than the previous one, since fewer women have children every generation. That means that for every subsequent generation, the one before them will be their baby boomers. So, what would you want? For the population to grow indefinitely? The amount of people on the planet is already unsustainable. Maybe. I am not saying that the population should grow indefinitely. But I am still not all that jolly about the population of the developed world straight up collapsing, since I just think it will create a rather brutal crisis and we will live through it. So, I am talking about it. And if the fertility of the developed countries becomes stable, its contribution to world population growth would be really not that significant compared to Africa, which is undergoing skyrocketing growth that will account for most of the world's growth this century. Another very often used argument is AI and robotics. The work will be automated, and thus the issue of lack of labor won't be a significant problem. But there is one major issue with this. Even if the most optimistic predictions regarding the implementation of AI and robotics in various fields are true, AI and robots do not consume. So they can help with the labor shortage part of the equation, but they really cannot do anything regarding the massive demographically driven consumption decline worldwide. So they cannot really address the biggest danger of the coming aging crisis. And of course, automation, AI implementation and robotization aren't free. They must be paid for by someone. And once again, we get to the problem of declining numbers of people, fewer scientists, shrinking tax bases, the elderly eating up a lot of the funds, and so on. If consumption declines and the current levels of production do not really have an economic justification, the investments into its maintenance in the world of fewer workers through automation also do not have an economic justification. Sure, there are all the theories about AI creating singularity and super exponential economic growth, resolving all our problems, and making us digital people decoupled from the material sphere. Okay, I am definitely not smart enough to say it won't happen, but I tend to stay on the skeptical side. If it happens, maybe the new train station in Brno and the highway to Vienna will be finally built. It probably won't. People often argue that we must stop focusing on economic growth and apply a degrowth strategy. Now, for the people who are proposing degrowth, I have good news. We are most likely going to experience the world of degrowth. It just won't be voluntary, and I think nobody will like it when it arrives. To cite a study about degrowth that I read when researching for this video, the consequence of degrowth is zero-sum society. With the size of the economic cake essentially fixed or shrinking, the economy is a theater of conflict. One group, or one country, can only improve itself at the expense of another. Redistribution, instead of production, is the basis of the economy. And at last, we come to the issue of climate change. The argument is relatively simple. The fixation on growth, rising populations, and consumption is damaging the environment, causing climate change, and is fundamentally unsustainable. Now, the damage done to the environment is just a fact. Fair enough. But are you sure that the massive population aging and the consequent crisis will help? The fight against climate change is a very, very expensive endeavor. Only the wealthy developed world is bending to prevent it, investing in new technologies, more ecological production, and such. Sure, you can argue that they are also responsible for much of the pollution. But if a massive economic crisis is caused by demographic development and people's living standards decline substantially, will they be willing to bear such costs and let their living standards decline even further? Or will they just forget about it instantly? I would say that the second option is more likely. Like it or not, climate change in the global north is still, to a large extent, an abstract issue. Sure, there are climate-connected problems, fires, hurricanes, floods and such. I do not want to downplay that and the sorrows it brings to the affected people at all. But the countries willing to sacrifice the most are not so far fundamentally threatened in their basic functioning by climate, as some countries in the developing world might be. And you can see as the atmosphere shifts, as the costs of the fight against climate change become apparent, for example in Germany or the UK. I think that in the case of a really major crisis, climate change will be the last thing on most people's minds. Governments will burn whatever will be available to get electricity and heat for their populations, if the situation worsens significantly. But yes, the massive population decline and consequent lower consumption of everything will likely be good for lowering carbon emissions. If there are 700 million fewer Chinese at the end of the century, and couple more 100 million fewer people around the rest of the developed world, it is hard to see how the emissions could not decline. So, fair enough, I will give you that. What I find baffling about people saying this is their tendency to perceive themselves as decoupled from the impacts of the decline. It is similar to the Black Death argument. Alright, maybe the planet will be better off in the end, but in the process of getting there, your life will likely suck unless you are an American. Will you be so comforted by the awareness of the possible climate-friendly impacts of the process? Maybe we have truly reached a point where a massive crisis is inevitable to start some new history cycle. I don't know. And maybe I'm completely wrong. When trying to read up on these issues, I'm always most surprised by how little attention it gets. Sure, you can get some articles about how we need to address ageism, or how it can actually be a benefit due to the booming health tech industry. Well, hopefully. Most of the research papers look at these issues on a country level, trying to develop policies to help mitigate the impacts of aging within countries. But there is not much on the compounding effects of it happening everywhere roughly at the same time. There is mostly just the work of Peter Zeihan. Maybe the fact that it will happen everywhere will help us to somehow deal with it. Honestly, it is strange just to predict such a large-scale crisis online. I do not want to be one of the people who just goes on about the coming crisis to get views. I am not 100% sure if I truly believe it. It is quite surreal and hard to imagine. I am not living my life as some prepper waiting for the apocalypse. Maybe I am completely off, but it just makes perfect sense to me. And the more I study demographics, the more I am flabbergasted by the lack of attention they get in the general historical and economic analysis of our world. What I found interesting about our day and age is that an incredible number of people seem to predict some impending doom, but they just choose different reasons for it. Most people choose climate change. Tech bros are waiting for AI to reach singularity and eliminate us. I chose the demographic implosion. Under almost every one of my videos about the demographic collapse, people are accusing me of being wrong. Not on the fact that we are screwed, but because I talk about the wrong reason why we are screwed. It is kind of like an impending doom buffet breakfast. At least we can agree on the fact that we are screwed. After nothing happens, we will all be pissed off.